Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll walk you through the process of modeling, UV unwrapping and texturing a simple weapon, the stylized blaster. This video is sped up by 4 times and nothing is cut out. If you want to follow along, you can always rely on subtitles, mute my audio, put on some good music and slow the video down in YouTube settings. The table of contents is also at your service. Check the video description and a pinned comment for the chapter list. Also, you can always inspect the model on Sketchfab. Let's start with a couple of clarifications. I modeled this blaster in 3ds Max 2024. For UV unwrapping, I used Rizom UV. I really like its straightening algorithm. Of course, you can unwrap your model in any software, but I wouldn't recommend doing it in Max, at least not without specialized plugins. I textured the model in Substance Painter. For this, I used only the basic Substance Painter materials. The only plugin I used in Max is the Loop Regularizer. You can always use Rapid tools and get the same result. The sticker was something I drew in Photoshop, which I won't be showing in this video, mainly because the process is kinda boring and doesn't refer to modeling. Last year, Substance Painter received a really handy tool to add stickers to your model in just a couple of clicks. Before we start, let's describe our weapon. The blaster has around 4K polygons and almost the same number of vertices. I didn't use the classic process of baking a high poly model onto a low poly one. Instead, I opted for the use low poly model as a high poly while baking setting. This isn't the best approach, as we're still using a normals map and could have gotten much better results with proper baking. My workflow is best suited for those of you who can confidently paint your model. Otherwise, we can still use the stylization tool in Substance Painter. As with my other models, I start with NURMs modeling while setting the iteration count to 2, and then shape the barrel. I get the desired shape and prepare most openings in it by holding the Shift key as I scale down the corresponding surface. Theoretically, we could achieve the same results by applying automatic retopology to one side of our blaster, though in that case, we'd need to ensure the holes don't have too many sides. The barrel has 24 sides that may seem a bit excessive. The rear button's frame also has 24 sides, while the side switch's frame has 16 sides. In fact, these numbers could have been scaled down to 16 and 12 sides accordingly. The lamp on top also has 16 sides. Side wires and a metal pipe on top of our blaster all have 8 sides. The holes for the connectors are made as follows. We apply a chamfer to the vertex, tessellate the resulting polygon, then delete it and apply the loop regularizer to its edges. Same goes for the wire that connects the barrel to the handle. The handle has 16 sides and the trigger opening has 8 sides. Small light bulbs that are placed on the tip of the barrel have 8 sides each. The trigger attachment also has 8 sides, while both the scope and the trigger have 16 sides. Since I wasn't working from a specific reference image, my approach was to add some wires and metal pipes to the parts of the blaster where they would fit naturally. I did some pre-planning, considering location points of potential attachment jacks. I modeled all wires as loft objects, using loft settings to subtly adjust their trajectories. I ensured the loft had the same number of sides as its corresponding openings. Each technical detail received a single chamfer, as did each intersection. To maintain clean geometry, I surrounded every intersection with a loop of near square polygons. Basically, the only thing to consider at this stage is to not to overextend with your poly count. 8 sides are more than enough for various wires and stuff. Buttons and round switches shall receive something around 12 to 14 sides. 16 sides would be enough for the barrel and the handle in most cases. You can create such tubes from simple cylinders using the bend modifier on its chosen parts. I get the angle I want and then move the gizmo of the bend modifier to the place where the desired curve starts. Each wire is made from an 8-sided spline that has its corner settings set to smooth. Make sure to give your wires enough supporting edge loops for them to look nice. I prefer to create models like this as single cohesive objects rather than assembling them from separate components. While it would be possible to insert the connector tubes into the blaster's barrel and simply attach wires as individual parts, which could reduce the overall polygon count and simplify the model, this approach comes with challenges. Specifically, care must be taken to avoid Z-fighting, a common issue in 3D rendering where two surfaces are positioned so closely together that the rendering engine struggles to determine which one should be displayed on top. This can result in visual artifacts such as flickering or overlapping textures, which compromise the model's appearance. Some spherical shapes, like the lighting bulb on top of the barrel or the scope flashlight thing, are made from hemispheres that are shrink down slightly on the corresponding axis. I scale each opening down while holding the Shift key and then collapse them in order to get the coordinates of the essential parts. Next I enable vertex snapping and build my splines that will eventually turn into wires between these centers. Next I go to the vertex tab of my splines and use the Refine tool to give my splines some extra geometry. Remember to set its vertex types to smooth. Wires along the edges of the blaster's barrel will be the key detail of our model's front section. Their curves define the style of our blaster and shape the main features of its barrel. We don't want them to be symmetrical or overly angular, as one of our goals is to break the unwanted symmetry of the model. Additionally, the wires should not be too thin. Generally, thin details should be avoided. Obviously, the thickness of the wires should be as substantial as possible, while still allowing them to be securely attached to the corresponding surfaces. At this point, I didn't notice that the frontal part of the blaster is angled. I'll align it, but a bit later. I don't recommend removing supporting edge loops from any of the wires. The thing is, even straight sections can bend if you decide to animate these wires, for example during the character's movement. The ideal option is to have nearly square polygons along the entire length of the wires. I removed the part of the video where I subsequently adjusted the curve of each wire. None of them are particularly different from the others. As you can see here, at this stage my wires are simply mirrored to the other side of the blaster. I will correct it at some point, so you can simply ignore it. I used a fairly high number of sides for the button frames located on curved surfaces. In reality, 12 to 14 sides would have been sufficient. We can easily remove excess sides by collapsing them, thereby forming triangles. Triangles may stand out on curved surfaces, but they are never noticeable on flat planes, provided of course that these planes won't deform during animation. In the case of 24 sides, we can simply collapse every other edge, using the dot loop selection and collapse tool. If we want to achieve a specific number of sides from a larger number, on a flat plane we can just collapse the required number of randomly selected sides, preferably not adjacent to each other, and then apply the loop regularizer to the resulting hole to make it perfectly round. At this stage, I am fixing the tube at the top of the blaster and moving some vertices to improve the overall polygon flow of our model. Additionally, I am adding a connector for the tube. We can reduce our polygon count as follows. By holding Shift, we use the Insert Edge Loop tool to add an edge that respects the existing polygon flow of the model. At the same time, we can remove the surrounding edge loops, replacing two loops with one. Technical holes receive single chamfers. I insert hemispheres and buttons into the corresponding slots using the Select and Place tool with the vertex snapping setting enabled. I move the faces of any holes by switching my coordinate system to local. I move points while having the edge constraint function enabled. When we place buttons into the corresponding holes in the model, we don't want to attach them to it the same way we attach the wires. Attached buttons won't be pressable if we ever decide to animate the model. Additionally, we don't want the backside of the buttons to share the same plane as the blaster itself. We should model the buttons as unpressed and offset them so that they intersect the model rather than just sit flush against it. The handle is formed from a simple sphere, with the number of sides matching the number of sides in the hole in the rear part of the blaster's barrel. The handle has 16 sides. This is determined not only by its upper part, but also by our desire for the lower hemisphere to look sufficiently smooth. It's worth considering here, if we want to see the pistol model from the outside, only in the character's hand, this polygon count can be reduced. However, if we will be picking up this pistol, or it will be lying on the shop counter or elsewhere, the model should be adapted to how we plan to use it. To attach the odd wire to the middle of the barrel, I add a couple of supporting edge loops in a way that forms a ring of near-square polygons around the circular hole. The handle is curved and requires a sufficient number of supporting edge loops. First, I manually create the base curve, and then add supporting edge loops while holding the Shift key. The ring protruding from the lower semicircle is formed with a simple extrude, after which I create the shape for the main wire, likely powering our blister, in the same way as I created the wires running along the barrel. As before, I don't want this part of the model to be symmetrical. Like all technical elements, the ring receives one chamfer on each side. The next step is preparing the hole for the trigger. I make it the same way I prepared the holes for the wires. Then I slightly reduce its inner part so that the angle leading to it isn't too sharp. Finally, I give it a single chamfer. For a while, I move vertices to fix the shading of the stock. I adjust them both with edge constraint enabled and in global coordinates to ensure artifacts aren't noticeable from any viewing angle. Many things will improve after enabling the weighted normals modifier. This should also be taken into account. I could leave the holes for the switches, buttons and trigger open, but it's simpler to just seal them and reduce the UV chucks that will be permanently obscured by other objects during the texturing stage. Sometimes the loop regularizer twists the openings it creates. We can rotate them to their proper angle by using the local coordinate system, angle snapping, and the rotate tool. The stylized cartoonish trigger is formed from a hemisphere with a single chamfer. In retrospect, I realize that 16 sides for it is clearly overkill. 12 to 14 sides would have been better. Its stem has 8 sides. The simplest approach is to intersect it with the trigger plane in a way that allows us to use triangles without risking shading issues. I didn't leave the back of the stem open. Its center is convenient to use as the trigger's pivot point when inserting it into corresponding hole and when moving it during animation. We can always position the pivot point where needed using the Select and Place tool. As with the other buttons and switches, we should ensure that the trigger's stem intersects the plane of the blaster's stock rather than sharing the same plane with it. I positioned the trigger at a slight angle to the blaster's handle. Overall, it turned out quite nice, plus I managed to compensate for the fact that the hole was positioned almost too high. Obviously, the trigger and also each button or switch that will be subjected to any animations shall stay separated from the main model. The side of the blaster received a round switch. Initially, I considered adding a couple of notes to it like in Star Trek, but then I realized I didn't want to add any inscriptions to the side of the model. In particular, I avoided this because inscriptions require high-resolution textures, and we might want to use 1K textures. I didn't change the polygon count for the button frame, only ensuring that the shading wasn't compromised. At this stage I realized I didn't want to mirror the button to the other side of the blaster, and instead I'll place some kind of a sticker there. The button also has 16 sides. As I mentioned earlier, that's too many, since we could easily have used just 12. I put the button in its place using the vertex snapping and the Select and Place tool. Then I move it inwards on the local axis to make it intersect my blaster. At some point, I decided to completely rework the front part of the blaster because it was too simplistic. I removed the previous version and created a cylinder with 24 sides, the same as our barrel, so that I could easily attach it to the existing geometry. Overall, this is too many sides, as I've mentioned before. If we had stuck to the rule of not exceeding 16 sides, using 6 to 8 for wires and 12 to 14 for large circular shapes, we could have reduced our polygon count by almost half. This result could also be achieved through topology, but I ruled it out to speed up the process. Ultimately, a pistol with 4K polygons for an indie game is quite acceptable. If you want to reduce the polygon count even further, you should generally abandon the principle of using rounded details and curved surfaces, opting instead for more blocky shapes. I created 6 vertices and turned them into hemispherical protruding lamps framing the barrel. Then I created the inner part of the barrel, somewhat like how it often looks in certain toys, and formed the central hole from which a laser, plasma, or ideally water could burst out. As I said before, we don't want to create small elements. The modeling style I follow involves working with fairly thick forms. Since this model has multiple elements, I name each of them properly. I want the name to start from something these parts have in common, like the blaster. Also, it may be a good idea to characterize the blaster somehow in its name, because a potential game scene might have many different blasters. The next part is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous videos. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I save my model, reset its pivot point, scale, rotation and X-form, set the pivot point to the bottom of the middle part and place it to 000 scene coordinates. Then I use the selection panel to scan my meshes for remaining angons. Technically, you can also remove poles and make sure there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next I use the 3ds Max's X-View tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. I had some isolated vertices, so I made a couple of boxes, attached them to those parts of my mesh that had isolated vertices, and then deleted the boxes. In most cases, this method fixes the bug. If you added some extra elements to the blaster's exterior, make sure they intersected and each other properly and don't share any vertices or planes. At this point you shall also reset the scale, rotation and X-form of most elements and set their pivot points manually, remembering their proper initial rotation angles. If you used mirroring or symmetry while modeling, it's especially important to reset the X-form of your model and make sure that there are no flipped normals remaining. Just make sure to save your file before resetting the X-form. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. There's nothing special about it, but once you are done you can also apply the weighted normals modifier to your model. Just make sure to set smoothing groups meticulously and mind that they will impact unwrapping. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. Hard edge placement is about controlling low poly smoothing behavior and baked normal gradation. UV seam placement is about optimizing usable texture space, while also limiting texture distortion. Bringing the two together is about balancing visual quality with resource efficiency. Using fewer hard edges and UV splits tends to be more resource efficient, but it's also important to make sure the final product looks good. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks and shapes. Normally you can avoid sharp angles and hard edges by beveling and chamfering these edges and going with everything smooth. It means more polygons but less drastic gradients on the low poly shading for the normal map to compensate when baked. To further improve shading on beveled low poly models, you can use weighted normals. My model doesn't have any transparent elements, so I've unwrapped it to a single 2K Reso UV map with a pixel padding of 16. That's pretty generous for this kind of a prop, especially considering the fact we use normals but don't bake anything. We can easily scale it down to 1K Reso. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rizom. Each wire and tube shall be straightened to receive some kind of stripes texture. At some point we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to the proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams that Substance Painter can't fix no matter what tricks you try. I unwrapped the model to ensure no overlapping UV elements. After placing all UV seams, I simply relax elements and position them horizontally or vertically, depending on their location. I mostly rely on Rizom Optimize tool, O hotkey, and also its straightening algorithm. To ensure smooth animation, we need to straighten the UV chucks for all parts of the model that will bend, such as various hoses and wires. Properly aligned UVs prevent texture stretching or warping during deformation, maintaining visual quality. Additionally, when unwrapping these areas, we should ensure sufficient resolution in the UV map to preserve detail and avoid pixelation. It's also a good practice to place seams strategically along less visible edges to minimize noticeable texture distortions during animation. Strategic UV seam placement is key. We can either position them along accessible edges for easy Substance Painter repairs with the Clone Stamp tool, or hide them in less visible areas. As an added solution, switching to triplanar projection in Substance Painter typically makes most seams disappear completely. 3ds Max shows flipped and overlapping UV chucks, while Rizom UV highlights areas where UV chucks are bent or stretched. Overall, we could stack some UV chucks, such as small lamps that surround the barrel's tip, since they not only take up space on the UV map, but also create a surrounding radius that other elements can't occupy. These other elements could have been slightly larger instead. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of raise on all tabs, disable the ID section, and switch my subsampling to 16. I've also made sure that there were no purple lines on my model or some red fragments. Also, I've selected the option to use my low poly model as a high poly one during baking. My texturing process went pretty lazy. We would get a maximum of this model if we actually hand painted it, but I mostly relied on some simple grunges. For lighting, I selected the Studio 3 environment map in display settings. As the base material, I used the Plastic Glossy Smart Material preset. I played around with the color and roughness settings, increasing the latter. Additionally, I experimented with dirt and dust, lowering the transparency of those layers in their blending options. I used different variations of the same plastic for my blaster. I created separate folders, hid them with black masks, and used the Polygon fill tool to paint parts of the model. Since I didn't have any reference images, I started with less vibrant colors and gradually adjusted them to the overall look you see in the video preview. I didn't use an external palette or anything like that, so I cut out the part of the video where I circled through options until I was satisfied with the result. It's always easier to unify a couple of muted colors. The more colors you see, and the brighter they are, the harder the process becomes, and the higher the risk of making the model look overly eclectic. I created an empty fill layer and filled it with ambient occlusion, switching its blending options to overlay. I also reduced the opacity of this layer, so it wouldn't stand out too much or make the model's cavities overly dark. For most layers, I chose triplanar projection to avoid potential UV seams. For the lamps, I used the Plastic Dusty Smart Material. I added an emissive layer in the Texture Set Settings menu and included emissive channels for all layers responsible for glowing objects. Don't forget to give these objects base layers in case you decide to turn off the emission. The springs were added as follows. First, the wires received a base layer of plastic or rubber, then a copper layer. The copper went into a separate folder, hidden by a black mask. I added a fill layer and selected Fill, Stripes. Initially, they were rotated at a 45-degree angle, so I changed it to 135 degrees. Then I added a Height Data fill layer and significantly increased its height value. The main wire received the Rubber Dry Preset Smart Material. I placed the Stylization tool below the ambient occlusion and sticker layers. For the sticker, I used Substance Painter's Custom Sticker tool. The sticker you see was drawn in Photoshop. Since I drew it with a mouse without a tablet, I'd rather not show how uneven its lines are. I set its projection type to UV projection. The sticker seemed too bright to me, so I added an HSL perspective filter and slightly lowered the saturation. Finally, I added an additional light layer under the stylization to highlight the edges of my model, making it look more plastic and cartoonish. The main idea of this project is to combine overly toy-like elements of the blister's body with tough metallic springs, something I'd expect to see in a movie like Mars Attacks. In the coming weeks, I plan to create another blister in the same style, aiming to reduce its polygon count by about a quarter without retopology. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.